until the city was a speck in his rearview mirror. To Marcus, the offer was a gift. To Julian, it felt like a trap. He thought about Sarah, the woman he had stopped texting 2 weeks ago. She had asked to leave a toothbrush at his place, and he had felt this exact same smothered feeling. He looked at his desk. It was perfectly clean. No photos of family, no messy piles of paper. Just his laptop and a single black pen. He realized that he treated his coworkers the same way he treated Sarah. He kept them at a distance so they couldn't see the mess of his real life. He viewed his colleagues as encroachers on his territory. He was an architect, a man who spent his life designing beautiful buildings. But standing there in the silence, he realized he had spent even more time building a wall around himself. He was 34 years old, and he was living in a glass box. He was successful, he was independent, and he was completely alone. The partner track wasn't just a career move. It was a threat to the only thing he felt he had left: his autonomy. The bricks of the fortress. How do we build these walls? We don't use stone and mortar. We use deactivating strategies. These are mental tricks our brains use to kill feelings of intimacy before they get too dangerous. Think of these strategies as the security system for your fortress. Whenever someone gets too close to the gate, the alarm goes off, and your brain starts looking for ways to push them back. One of the most common bricks is called the flaw finder. Have you ever been dating someone who seemed perfect, but then suddenly you couldn't stand the way they chewed their food? Or maybe you decided they dressed weird, or their laugh was too loud. This isn't just you being picky. It's your brain trying to find a reason to run. By focusing on a small flaw, you can convince yourself that the person isn't the one. Another brick is the Phantom X. This is when you keep thinking about the one that got away. You compare everyone you meet to an old partner from years ago. Because the old partner isn't actually there, they can be perfect in your mind. This prevents you from ever having to be fully present with the person sitting right in front of you. You are protecting yourself from a real relationship by pining for an imaginary one. Then there's the future-free zone. This is when you refuse to make plans. If someone asks if you want to go on a trip 3 months from now, you feel a surge of panic. To you, a plan is a contract. It feels like you are giving up your freedom to change your mind. By keeping the future blank, you feel like you still have the keys to the exit door. These strategies work very well. They keep people at a distance. They keep you from feeling suffocated, but they also keep you from being known. When you use these bricks, you aren't actually interacting with a person. You are interacting with a version of them that you have filtered through your fear. The autonomy-intimacy seesaw. At the heart of the avoidant mindset is a struggle that feels like a seesaw. On one side is autonomy, your freedom and independence. On the other side is intimacy, closeness and connection. For most people, these two things can exist together. You can be close to someone and still be your own person. But for the avoidant mind, the seesaw is broken. You believe that if intimacy goes up, autonomy must go down. It feels like a zero-sum game. If you give someone your time, your feelings, or a drawer in your dresser, you feel like you are losing a piece of your soul. This belief often comes from a misunderstanding of what it means to be a self-made person. In the 1800s, an author named Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a famous essay called Self-Reliance. He said that imitation is suicide, and that we should trust our own thoughts above all else. Many people with avoidant patterns treat this essay like a holy book. They believe that needing anyone is a sign of weakness. They take pride in being the person who doesn't need anyone. They think that by being totally independent, they are winning at life. But Emerson wasn't saying we should live in a hole in the ground. He was saying we should have our own ideas. There is a huge difference between true agency, knowing who you are, and false autonomy, being afraid to need help. False autonomy is a shield. It is a way of saying, you can't hurt me because I don't need you. True agency is saying, I know who I am, so I am not afraid to let you in. When you are stuck on the seesaw, you spend all your energy trying to keep your side up. You become so obsessed with not being controlled that you end up being controlled by your fear of control. The brain in the bunker. This isn't just all in your head. It's in your biology. Your brain has two main parts that fight for control when someone tries to get close to you. First, there is the amygdala. This is the oldest part of your brain. It is the alarm system. Its only job is to look for threats. When a partner says, we need to talk, or I want to spend more time together, the avoidant amygdala doesn't hear a request for love. It hears a predator coming to take away its freedom. It triggers the same response as seeing a mountain lion in the woods. Your heart speeds up, your muscles tense, and your brain screams, "Get out." The second part is the prefrontal cortex. This is the logical part of your brain. It's the CEO. In a secure person, the CEO can look at the alarm and say, "Hey, calm down. It's just a conversation about dinner plans." But in an avoidant person, the CEO and the amygdala are on the same team. Instead of calming the alarm, the logical brain starts coming up with facts to justify the fear. It starts thinking, "She's too needy. This relationship is slowing down my career. I was happier when I was single." This is why it is so hard to talk yourself out of avoidant feelings. Your logical brain is busy building the wall, not trying to tear it down. You aren't just thinking these things. Your nervous system is convinced that closeness is a physical danger. Understanding this is the first step toward change. You have to realize that the smothered feeling isn't a sign that the relationship is bad. It's a sign that your alarm system is oversensitive. You are like a house with a smoke detector that goes off every time you try to boil water. The house isn't on fire. The sensor is just set too high. The secret room. Building an invisible fortress is an exhausting job. You have to be on guard 24 hours a day. You have to monitor your phone, your schedule, and your facial expressions. You have to make sure you don't say "I love you" too soon, or let someone stay over too many nights in a row. It feels like safety, but it's actually a high-stress lifestyle. Think back to those babies in Mary Ainsworth's study. They looked like they were having fun with their toys, but their hearts were hammering at 160 beats per minute. That is what it's like to live with a dismissive avoidant mindset. You are playing with your toys, your career, your hobbies, your solo travels, but your body is constantly waiting for the threat of connection to return. The tragedy of the fortress is that it works too well. Eventually, people stop knocking on the gate. They get tired of the flaw finder and the future phobia. They move on to find someone who is willing to stand in the sun with them. And that's when the lone wolf looks around and realizes that his fortress has no windows. He has achieved total independence, but he has no one to share it with. He has become Howard Hughes in the Desert Inn, king of a castle that smells like old newspapers and regret. But there is a secret room in the fortress that most avoidant people don't know about. It's the room where you keep the messy parts of yourself, the parts that feel lonely, the parts that want to be held, and the parts that are scared of being rejected. You built the wall to protect that room, but the irony is that the only way to feel truly safe is to let someone into it. Safety doesn't come from being untouchable. It comes from being known and accepted. As Julian stood in his glass office, he didn't know how to open the door yet. He didn't even know where the door was, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to admit that the view from the 42nd floor was getting very, very cold. He was starting to see that his autonomy was just a fancy word for hiding. We are going to look at the blueprints of your own fortress. We are going to find out who taught you to build it and why. But more importantly, we are going to learn how to install some windows. Because the truth is, you can have your independence and your intimacy too. You don't have to give up your soul to have a partner. You just have to realize that a house is only a home when someone else has a key. This journey isn't about tearing down everything you are. It's about realizing that a wall is just a fence, but a boundary is a door. And doors are the only things that let the air in. Just like a seed needs the soil to grow, a connection that seems to trap it, but actually gives it life, we need each other to truly become who we are meant to be. Without that soil, we are just a seed sitting on a shelf. Safe, dry, and completely dead. Chapter 3. 3 Origins of the Dismissive Heart. In the spring of 1536, a young girl named Elizabeth stood in the drafty hallways of a royal palace. She was only 2 years old, but the world around her was already shattering. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had just been led to the executioner's block on the orders of her father, King Henry VIII. In an instant, Elizabeth went from being a princess to being illegitimate. She was a child who no longer had a place. Her father didn't just move on, he replaced her mother within days. For Elizabeth, the message was loud and clear. People you love can disappear in a heartbeat. To depend on someone is to put your life in their hands, and those hands might just tighten around your neck. While Elizabeth was learning to pull inward, her older half-sister Mary was taking a different path. Mary had also been cast aside by their father, but her reaction was the opposite. She spent her life desperately trying to please her father, clinging to her faith and her mother's memory with a white-knuckled grip. Mary grew up to be a woman who needed constant reassurance. When she eventually married, She became so obsessed with her husband that her own people turned against her. She was the clinger, the one who would do anything to keep a spark of love alive, even if it burned her. Elizabeth watched Mary's struggle from the shadows. She saw how Mary's emotional hunger made her weak and easy to manipulate. Elizabeth made a silent vow. She would never let a man, a husband, or even a close friend have that kind of power over her. She began to build a wall around her heart that no one could climb. She became a master of seeing and saying nothing. By the time she became queen, she famously declared she would have no master. She chose to be the Virgin Queen, not because she didn't want love, but because she couldn't afford the cost of it. Her avoidance wasn't a personality flaw, it was her greatest survival tool. The house of silence, the path of neglect. Most people with a dismissive, avoidant heart didn't grow up in a royal palace with executioners, but they did grow up in a house of silence. This is the first of the three main origins. In this home, there is a literal or emotional vacuum. You might have had parents who were physically there, but they were miles away in their minds. Maybe they were working 3 jobs, or maybe they were struggling with their own sadness or addictions. In the house of silence, when a child cries, no one comes. Or if they do come, they don't offer comfort. They offer a distraction or a command to be quiet. If you grew up here, you learned a very logical lesson. My needs do not matter to other people. You realized early on that if you wanted to be fed, comforted, or entertained, you had to do it yourself. This creates a child who is scary smart at taking care of themselves. You might have been making your own cereal and tucking yourself into bed. While other kids were running to their moms because of a scraped knee, you were in the bathroom cleaning the cut and putting on your own bandage. You became your own parent. The problem is that this self-parenting creates a deep-seated belief that other people are unreliable. When you enter a relationship as an adult, you still feel like that 5-year-old in the kitchen. You think, why would I tell my partner I'm sad? They won't know what to do with it anyway. You see intimacy as a burden because you've never known it to be a source of actual help. You are a lone scout because the house of silence taught you that the only person you can trust is the one looking back at you in the mirror. The house of no walls, the path of enmeshment. The second origin is the exact opposite of neglect. It is the house of no walls. In this home, a parent is often overbearing or smothering. They don't just love the child, they use the child to fill their own emotional holes. They might tell the child their deepest secrets or expect the child to be their best friend and therapist. If you grew up here, you didn't feel lonely, you felt swallowed. You felt like your skin didn't belong to you. Your parent might have barged into your room without knocking, read your diary, or become upset if you wanted to spend time with friends instead of them. In this house, closeness feels like a trap. It feels like losing your air. Children from the house of no walls grow up to be very sensitive to the weight of other people. As an adult, when a partner asks, "What are you thinking?" or "Why don't we spend more time together?" it doesn't feel like a request for love. It feels like a cage door slamming shut. Your brain screams, "They're trying to take my life away again." To survive this kind of childhood, you learned to build a secret world inside your head. You became an expert at checking out while still standing in the room. This is why you might ghost someone or go cold the moment a relationship starts to feel serious. You aren't trying to be mean. You are just trying to find a place where you can finally breathe. Your independence is your oxygen, and you'll do anything to keep the supply from being cut off. The house of gold stars, the path of performance. The third origin is perhaps the most common for high achievers. It is the house of gold stars. In this home, love isn't something you get for free just because you exist. Love is a reward for what you do. In this house, the parents are often very proud of the child's grades, sports trophies, or musical talents. But when the child is messy, when they are crying, angry, or failing, the parents disappear or become cold. The child learns that their inner self is unacceptable, but their outer performance is valuable. If this was your childhood, you grew up believing that people only like you for your utility. You think, if I'm not being successful or helpful or perfect, then I am invisible. This creates a massive fear of intimacy. Why? Because intimacy is where the mess lives. You can't be perfect when you're being intimate. You can't keep the gold star mask on 24/7. When a partner tries to get close to the real you, you feel a sense of panic. You think that if they see the parts of you that aren't shiny, they will leave. So you keep them at a distance. You stay busy. You focus on your career. You become the perfect partner on paper. You pay the bills, you fix the house, you look great, but you never let them see your heart. You've been trained to believe that your heart is the only part of you that isn't worth loving. The emotional vacuum and the invisible fortress. Regardless of which house you grew up in, the result is the same. The building of the invisible fortress. Think of this fortress as a mental blueprint. It's a set of rules that your brain uses to keep you safe. Rule 1. Never let them see you need anything. Rule 2. Always have an exit plan. Rule 3. Feelings are noise that get in the way of facts. These rules aren't wrong. For Elizabeth I, these rules kept her alive in a world of traitors. For a child in a neglectful home, these rules kept them fed. For a child in an enmeshed home, these rules kept them sane. The problem is that the fortress that saved your life as a child is now ruining your life as an adult. When you are inside the fortress, you are safe from being swallowed or abandoned, but you are also cut off from the very thing humans need to survive: connection. This creates what psychologists call an emotional vacuum. On the outside, you look like you have it all together. You are the cool one. You don't get dramatic. But inside the vacuum, there is a quiet, persistent ache. It's the feeling of being a ghost in your own life. You are there, but no one really knows you. You want to be loved. But the moment love shows up at the gate of your fortress, you treat it like an invading army. Why we choose the wrong partners. One of the strangest things about these childhood origins is that they often lead us to the very people who trigger us the most. If you grew up in the house of silence, you might find yourself dating someone who is very loud and demanding of your attention. If you grew up in the house of no walls, you might find yourself with someone who is incredibly clingy. This isn't a mistake. Your brain is actually trying to solve an old puzzle. It's looking for a familiar blueprint. If you are an avoidant person, you are often drawn to anxious partners because they feel familiar. They represent the noise or the neediness you dealt with as a child. By picking someone who pushes against your walls, you get to keep your walls up. It gives you a reason to stay in your fortress. You can say, "I'm not the problem, they are just too much." As long as you have a partner who is too much, you never have to face the fact that you are too little in your emotional availability. It's a perfect, painful cycle that keeps your childhood patterns alive. The turning point. Awareness is the first crack. The good news is that blueprints can be redrawn. Elizabeth I remained avoidant until her death because she had to. She was a queen in a dangerous century. But you don't have to stay in the 1500s. You are not at risk of being executed for having a feeling. The first step in dismantling the fortress is simply recognizing which house you grew up in. If you grew up with neglect, your work is learning that it is safe to ask for help. If you grew up with enmeshment, your work is learning that you can have boundaries without having to run away. If you grew up with performance, your work is learning that you are lovable even when you are failing. When you start to see these patterns, you start to see that your coldness isn't who you are. It's just a jacket you put on a long time ago because the world felt cold. You can take the jacket off. It might feel itchy or scary at first, but the air is much warmer than you remember. Julian's blueprint. Back in Seattle, Julian Vane sat in his glass-walled office, staring at the blueprints for a new library. He was famous for his clean lines. His buildings were beautiful, but some critics said they felt a bit unwelcoming. They were all steel and glass, hard, reflective, and impossible to mar. His mind drifted to a memory of his father. Julian was 10 years old, and he had spent 3 weeks building a model bridge out of toothpicks. He had been so proud of it. When his father came home, Julian held it up, his heart thumping. His father didn't even look up from his briefcase. He just said, "That's nice, Julian. Don't leave a mess on the table." Julian didn't cry. He didn't get angry. He just took the bridge to his room, broke it into pieces, and threw it in the trash. He decided that day that he would never show his heart to his father again. If he didn't show it, it couldn't be ignored. Now, at 34, Julian realized he was still throwing his bridges away. Every time a woman like Sarah or Maya tried to look at his model, his inner life, he felt that same coldness he felt at the kitchen table. He would dismantle the relationship before they could ignore him or tell him he was making a mess. He looked at the library plans again. He had designed it with no cozy corners, no places for people to really gather and linger. It was a transit hub, not a home. For the first time in his career, he picked up his pencil and drew a small, unnecessary courtyard in the center. It was a space that served no purpose other than to let the light in. His hand shook slightly. It was just a drawing, but to Julian, it felt like he was punching a hole in his own wall. He thought about Maya. He hadn't texted her back in 3 days. The house of gold stars he had built for himself was starting to feel very, very lonely. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over her name. He didn't send the text yet, but for the first time, he didn't delete her number either. The story of his fortress was still being written, but today, he had at least decided to look out the window. Chapter 4. Mapping Your Emotional Landscape. From 30,000 feet above the frozen edge of the world, the Antarctic looks like a sheet of white paper with no writing on it. It is the most honest landscape on Earth because it offers absolutely nothing to the eye except what is already there: ice, wind, and sky. In the winter of 1934, a tiny black speck appeared on that white paper. It was a shack, buried deep in the snow, hundreds of miles away from the nearest human being. Inside that shack was a man named Admiral Richard Byrd. He had spent years leading men on great adventures, but he felt a strange, quiet pressure building inside him during those trips. He felt crowded by the needs of his crew. He felt exhausted by the constant we of leadership. He wanted to find out who he was when there was no one else around to watch him. He wanted to be the lone scout of his own life. He believed that if he could just get far enough away from the demands of other people, he would finally find peace. He called his mission a search for total solitude. For the first few weeks, the silence was a gift. Byrd felt a sense of relief that many people with avoidant patterns would recognize instantly. It is that sigh the heart takes when a partner leaves for a week-long trip, or when a high-pressure project finally ends. He spent his days measuring the weather and his nights reading by a small stove. He was the master of his own tiny world. He didn't have to explain his moods to anyone. He didn't have to compromise. He was, in his own mind, perfectly independent. But the Antarctic has a way of finding the cracks in a person's armor. A vent in Byrd's stove began to leak carbon monoxide, a gas you cannot see or smell. Slowly, it began to poison him. Because he was alone, there was no one to tell him that his voice sounded strange or that his thinking was becoming fuzzy. His independence became his greatest danger. As his body grew weak and his mind began to slip, he realized something that changed the course of his life. Without the tether of other people, he was losing his grip on what was real. He began to hallucinate. He felt the vast, cold universe pressing down on him, and he realized that his invisible fortress, the shack, and the miles of ice he had put between himself and the world, wasn't a sanctuary, it was a cage. He wrote in his diary that man is not an island, and that the oxygen of connection is just as vital as the air we breathe. He had to be rescued, barely alive, by men who had to fight through the ice to find him. He went into the white desert to prove he didn't need anyone, and he came out realizing that needing people was the only thing that kept a person sane. The fog of the inner world. Byrd's struggle in the ice is a perfect mirror for the avoidant emotional landscape. When you have a dismissive attachment style, you often feel like you are living in your own version of that Antarctic shack. You value your peace above everything else. You see the needs of others as a leak in your system, something that threatens to drain your energy or poison your mood. You might even feel a sense of pride in how little you need from others. The problem is that when we spend our lives avoiding the mess of feelings, we lose the ability to map our own internal world. We become like Byrd in the middle of a whiteout storm. We know we are moving, but we have no idea which way is north. We feel a tightness in our chest, or a fuzziness in our brain. We don't have the words to describe it. Psychologists call this alexithymia. It is a fancy word for a simple problem: the inability to identify and name your emotions. For an avoided person, this isn't a glitch. It is a survival strategy. If you don't name the feeling, you don't have to deal with it. If you don't admit you are lonely, you don't have to risk being rejected while looking for company. But just like Byrd's carbon monoxide poisoning, the feelings you ignore don't go away. They just sit in the room with you, making you tired, irritable, and disconnected. Mapping your emotional landscape means learning to see the landmarks in your mind before you hit the panic button and run. It requires looking at the white paper of your inner life and starting to draw the mountains, the valleys, and the hidden traps. Finding the body's alarm system. Long before your brain tells you, I need to get out of this relationship, your body has already sent out a flare. The human nervous system is an incredible piece of machinery. It is constantly scanning the environment for threats. For someone with secure attachment, a partner walking into the room is a signal of safety. For someone with avoidant attachment, that same person walking in can sometimes trigger a threat response. This happens because the invisible fortress we build is physical. When someone gets too close or asks a question that feels too personal, your body reacts as if a predator is nearby. You might not feel fear in the way you would if a bear were chasing you, but the signals are there if you know how to look for them. Common avoidant alarms in the body include a sudden sharp tension in the shoulders or neck, a feeling of heaviness in the stomach, like you've swallowed a stone, a physical urge to move your chair back or stand up and leave the room, a clamping sensation in the throat, making it hard to speak, a sudden loss of eye contact, where your gaze drops to the floor or shifts to a window. Mapping your landscape starts with these physical clues. You cannot think your way out of an avoidant spiral if you aren't aware that the spiral has started. The next time you are with a partner, a friend, or even a coworker, and you feel the sudden urge to shut down, stop for a second. Don't listen to the thoughts in your head yet. Just look at your body. Where is the tension? What does the suffocation feel like? Is it a lack of air, or is it a weight on your chest? By identifying these physical landmarks, you begin to turn the whiteout of your emotions into a map you can actually read. You move from "I'm just annoyed" to "my body is reacting to this person's request for time as if it's a threat to my survival." That realization is the first step toward the exit of the fortress. Julian's blank map. Julian Vane sat in a leather chair that felt far too soft for his liking. He was in a therapist's office in downtown Seattle, and he was currently trying to figure out how to leave without being rude. He had come because his boss had suggested he work on his people skills to get the partner track promotion, but Julian felt like a fish out of water. The therapist, a woman with kind eyes named Dr. Reyes, asked him a simple question. "Julian, how do you feel right now, in this moment?" Julian looked at the ceiling. He looked at a small plant on the windowsill. He felt a wave of irritation. "I feel like I'm wasting time," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "I have a deadline on the waterfront project, and sitting here talking about my feelings isn't going to get the blueprints drawn." "That's a thought," Dr. Aris said gently. "But what is the feeling in your body right now as you think about that deadline?" Julian paused. He wanted to say nothing. He usually felt nothing or fine. But as he sat there, forced to stay still, he noticed a buzzing sensation in his hands. He noticed that his jaw was clamped so tight it ached. He felt a strange, cold hollowness in the center of his chest. He didn't have a word for it. He didn't have a landmark for this sensation. "It feels itchy," Julian finally said. "Like I want to jump out of my skin. Like there's too much noise in the room, even though it's quiet." This was Julian's first micro-disclosure. He wasn't sharing a deep secret about his childhood. He was just mapping the immediate territory. For the first time in his life, he was admitting that his calm, analytical exterior was actually a mask for a body that was screaming to run away. He was realizing that his map was mostly blank, and he was just now starting to draw the first lines. The trigger inventory. Once you begin to notice how your body reacts, you can start to identify the specific triggers that set off the alarm. A trigger is like a tripwire. You're walking along, minding your own business, and suddenly snap, the walls go up and the lone wolf takes over. For the avoidant mind, triggers usually fall into a few specific categories. Identifying which ones affect you most is like finding the danger zones on your map. The future talk trigger. This happens when a partner mentions a vacation 6 months away or talks about moving in together. To a secure person, this is exciting. To an avoidant person, it feels like a cage door slamming shut. It triggers a future phobia, where the brain tries to find reasons to end the relationship now so you don't get trapped later. The we overload. This is the feeling of losing your I. If a partner starts saying, "we should do this," or "we like that," you might feel a sudden sharp need to do something entirely solo just to prove you still exist. The vulnerability request. This happens when someone asks, "What are you thinking?" or "Are you okay?" The avoidant brain views these questions as probes or encroachments on private territory. The immediate response is usually to say, "I'm fine," or "nothing," even if your mind is racing. The physical closeness trap. Sometimes even something as simple as long-term cuddling or holding hands can trigger a suffocation response. Your body feels like it's being consumed by the other person's presence. Creating a trigger inventory means writing these down. You have to be honest with yourself. When did you last feel the urge to ghost someone? What happened just before that feeling arrived? Was it a text message, a specific question, a look they gave you? When you know where the tripwires are, you can choose to step over them instead of letting them blow up your life. The secondary emotion shield. One of the trickiest parts of mapping your emotional landscape is dealing with the shield. Because true vulnerability, feeling fear, sadness, or a need for others, feels dangerous, the avoidant brain often swaps those soft emotions for hard ones. This is the secondary emotion shield. It is a form of emotional camouflage. Imagine you are on a date. The person you are with is being very kind and open. They tell you they really like spending time with you. In that moment, you might feel a flicker of fear. The fear that they will eventually see the real you and leave, or the fear that they will want more than you can give. But the invisible fortress doesn't want you to feel fear. Fear is a weak emotion that requires other people to comfort you. So, in a split second, your brain swaps the fear for boredom or judgment. Suddenly, you find yourself thinking, wow, this person is actually kind of annoying. Why do they laugh like that? They're way too into me. This is boring. I'd rather be at home watching a movie. That boredom isn't real. It is a deactivating strategy. It is a brick you are putting in the wall to protect yourself from the scary feeling of being liked. Other common shield emotions include irritation, getting angry over small things like how they chew or their choice of music to create emotional distance. Intellectual superiority, thinking, they just aren't on my level, to justify why you shouldn't get close. Sarcasm, using humor to deflect any moment that starts to feel too sincere. Mapping your landscape requires you to look behind the shield. When you feel bored or irritated by someone you were excited about yesterday, ask yourself, what am I afraid of right now? Usually the answer is some version of I'm afraid of being found out or I'm afraid of losing my freedom. The oxygen of connection. Admiral Byrd eventually realized that he couldn't survive on his own internal air. He needed the feedback, the touch, and the presence of others to remain a whole person. When he was finally rescued, he didn't give up his love for the Antarctic or his desire for quiet, but he changed how he lived. He realized that connection wasn't a luxury, it was a biological necessity. As an avoidant person, you have likely spent a lot of time thinking that connection is a cost. You think of it in terms of what you have to give up. Your time, your space, yourself. But mapping your landscape allows you to see connection as fuel. When you are securely connected, you don't actually lose your independence. You gain a secure base. Think of it like a mountain climber. If you are climbing a cliff without a rope, you are independent. But you are also terrified. Every move is a risk. You can't go very high because you're too busy trying not to die. But if you have a rope and a partner at the bottom holding it, a secure attachment, you are actually more free. You can take bigger risks. You can climb higher. You can focus on the view instead of the fall. The rope isn't trapping you. It's the thing that allows you to be an adventurer. Bird's shack was a place where he tried to live without the rope. He thought the rope was a burden. He found out it was the only thing that kept him attached to life. Drawing the first lines. Mapping your emotional landscape isn't something you do once and then finish. It is a practice. It is a way of moving through the world with your eyes open to your own internal weather. It starts with the body map, moves to the trigger inventory, and eventually allows you to see through the secondary emotion shield. This work is often quiet and unglamorous. It happens in the 5 seconds after a partner asks you a hard question. It happens when you're sitting in traffic and you feel that itch to cancel your plans and go home. It's the moment you choose to say, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now, instead of, I'm fine, leave me alone. For Julian, the map was still mostly white. But as he left Dr. Eris's office, he didn't just feel itchy. He felt a tiny, strange spark of curiosity. He wondered why his jaw was so tight. He wondered what that cold feeling in his chest was trying to tell him. For the first time, he wasn't just running through the landscape. He was looking at it. He walked toward the waterfront, the Seattle mist dampening his coat. He took a deep breath of the salty air. He didn't have all the answers, and his invisible fortress was still very much standing. But he had drawn the first line on the paper. He had acknowledged that he was there, in the room, feeling something. And the world hadn't ended. Mapping the territory is how you stop being a victim of your own patterns. You stop reacting and start observing. When you can see the storm coming on your map, you don't have to be afraid of the wind. You just have to know where the shelter is and how to keep the fire burning until the air clears. As you move forward, keep your trigger inventory in mind. Don't judge yourself for your tripwires. Everyone has them. The goal isn't to have a perfect map with no danger zones. The goal is simply to have a map that is accurate. When you know where the ice is thin, you can walk around it. When you know where the oxygen of connection is, you can breathe. Chapter 5. The Night the Bridge Burned. In a quiet lab at UCLA in the early 2000s, a researcher named Naomi Eisenberger sat behind a computer screen, watching the brain of a volunteer light up like a neon sign. The volunteer was playing a simple video game called Cyberball. In the game, there were 2 other players on the screen. All 3 were tossing a digital ball back and forth. The volunteer thought they were playing with 2 real people in another room. In reality, it was just a computer program. For the first few minutes, the game was fair. The ball went to everyone. But then, the computer program changed. The 2 other players started tossing the ball only to each other. They completely ignored the volunteer. The volunteer was being left out. It was a tiny digital snub. You might think a grown adult would just shrug it off, but inside the fMRI machine, the volunteer's brain was screaming. The areas of the brain that lit up were the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. These are the exact same spots that fire off when you slam your hand in a car door or stub your toe on a sharp rock. The brain did not see a difference between a broken heart and a broken leg. To your nervous system, being left out is a physical injury. This study proved that humans are wired to need each other for survival. We are not designed to be solo flyers. Yet, for many people, the invisible fortress is a way of life. They spend years convincing themselves they don't need the ball. They tell themselves they didn't even want to play the game in the first place. They build a life where no one can hurt them, but in doing so, they build a life where no one can truly reach them either. Eventually, that fortress becomes a very lonely place to live. There usually comes a night when the walls feel less like a shield and more like a cage. For some, it happens during a divorce. For others, it's the death of a parent or a health scare. It is the moment when the lone wolf strategies finally fail. The king of the invisible fortress. In the late 1800s, there was no one more famous, more witty, or more seemingly untouchable than Oscar Wilde. He was the king of the London social scene. He was brilliant, wealthy, and had a sharp tongue that could cut anyone down to size. Wilde lived his life behind a mask of irony and intellect. He made sure everyone knew he was the smartest person in the room, which kept people at a safe distance. He was surrounded by people, but he didn't really connect with them. He had an audience, not a community. Wilde once famously said, "To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance." It sounded like the ultimate anthem for independence. He used his wit as a deactivating strategy. If things got too emotional or too serious, he cracked a joke. He dazzled them with a story until they forgot what they were asking. He was a master at building bridges that looked beautiful, but were actually designed to keep him from ever having to cross over into true vulnerability. Then, in 1895, the bridge burned. Wilde was put on trial for gross indecency. Within weeks, the man who was the toast of London became a pariah. His friends vanished, his money was gone. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor in Reading Gaol. He went from silk sheets and champagne to a cold stone cell with a wooden plank for a bed. He was forced to walk in circles for hours and pick apart old ropes until his fingers bled. For the first time in his life, his intellect couldn't save him. His wit was useless against the silence of a prison cell. He was totally and completely alone. The invisible fortress he had spent decades building had turned into a literal stone box. At first, Wilde was filled with rage and bitterness. He blamed everyone else. He stayed in his avoidant shell, refusing to admit he needed help or comfort. He tried to maintain his unmoved persona, even as his health failed. He was the lonely king, sitting on a throne of dust. But then, something shifted. The weight of the isolation became too much to bear. The strategies that had worked for him in the ballrooms of London, the distance, the coldness, the superiority, didn't work in the dark. He hit what psychologists call the breaking point. This is the moment where the pain of staying closed off finally becomes greater than the fear of opening up. While in prison, Wilde began to write. He didn't write funny plays or clever poems. He wrote a long, raw, and painful letter to a man who had betrayed him. This letter became known as De Profundis, which means from the depths. In those pages, Wilde dropped every mask. He stopped being the smartest man in the room and became a human being in pain. He admitted he was lonely. He admitted he was broken. He wrote, "Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground." He realized that his independence had been a lie. He had spent his life running away from the very things that make life worth living: deep, messy, honest connection. By the time he left prison, he was a different man. He was no longer the lone wolf. He was someone who understood that the oxygen of connection is the only thing that keeps the soul alive. The collapse of the facade. Most people who struggle with avoidant attachment don't end up in a Victorian prison. Instead, their breaking point is often much quieter. It might happen at age 40, when you realize your perfectly curated apartment feels like a museum where no one visits. It might happen after your third 3-month fade in a row, when the excitement of a new person is replaced by the hollow realization that you are just repeating the same script over and over. The avoidance strategy works very well for a long time. It helps you get through a difficult childhood. It helps you excel in your career because you aren't distracted by drama. It makes you feel strong and self-reliant. But this strength is often what psychologists call a false facade. Imagine a house that looks amazing from the street. It has fresh paint and beautiful windows. But if you walk inside, there are no floors. There is no plumbing. There is no heat. It is a shell designed to impress the neighbors, but it isn't a place where anyone can actually live. The collapse of the facade happens when you finally realize you are tired of living in a shell. This collapse usually follows a specific pattern. The high point. You feel proud of your independence. You tell people you just haven't met the right person, or you value your freedom too much. The trigger. A major life event happens. You get sick, or a close friend moves away. The failure of self-soothing. You try to handle the stress on your own, like you always do. But this time, it doesn't work. The hobbies, the work, and the distractions don't fill the hole. The crisis of loneliness. You look around and realize that while you have many contacts, you have very few connections. You realize that if you disappeared tomorrow, it would take a long time for anyone to notice. The choice. You either double down on the isolation and become bitter, or you start the hard work of dismantling the wall. This is the night the bridge burned. It is the moment you realize that the very thing you thought was protecting you, your distance, is actually what is hurting you. The lonely king syndrome. When we are in our fortress, we often develop what is called the lonely king syndrome. This is a mental state where you feel superior to others because you don't need them. You look at people who are in love or who depend on their families, and you think they are weak or needy. You tell yourself that you are the only one who is truly free. You are the king of your own island. But kings who rule over empty islands aren't actually powerful. They are just isolated. This syndrome is a defense mechanism. If you tell yourself that connection is weakness, then you don't have to feel bad about not having it. It's like a person who can't find water in the desert and decides that being thirsty is actually a sign of elite survival skills. The problem is that your body and your brain know the truth. Just like the volunteers in the cyberball study, your nervous system is still firing off pain signals. You might experience this as a dull ache in your chest, a constant feeling of boredom, or a sense that life is just a series of tasks to be completed, rather than an experience to be enjoyed. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, saw this in his work with children and adults. He noticed that people who had been let down by their parents often developed a stiff upper lip. They looked tough on the outside, but their internal lives were frozen. Bowlby called this affectionless detachment. It wasn't that these people didn't have feelings. It was that they had learned that showing feelings was dangerous. They burned the bridge to their own hearts so no one could get in and cause more damage. When the strategy becomes a liability. For Julian Vane, the architect we met earlier, the breaking point didn't come from a prison cell or a tragic loss. It came from a series of small, cold realizations. Julian was at the top of his game at his firm. He was known for his clean designs, buildings made of glass and steel that looked like they belonged in a futurist movie. But his personal life was a revolving door. He had a very specific exit plan for every woman he dated. Month 1, the dazzle phase. He was charming and attentive, but only on his own terms. Month 2, the flaw-finding phase. He would start to notice small things, the way she laughed too loudly, or the fact that she liked movies he found lowbrow. Month 3, the suffocation phase. As soon as the woman asked to spend a weekend together, or hinted at a future, Julian felt a physical tightness in his chest. He felt like he was running out of air. He would then burn the bridge. He would stop texting. He would become cold. He would make the other person feel like they were too much until they eventually left. Julian would feel a brief sense of relief, followed by a long, quiet period of lone wolf pride. Julian sat in his perfectly minimalist living room. He had just successfully pushed away Sarah, a woman who was kind, smart, and actually respected his space. He had used his flaw finder strategy to convince himself she was too clingy because she wanted to leave a toothbrush at his place. He looked at the empty spot on his bathroom counter where her toothbrush would have been. Then he looked at his designer sofa, his expensive sound system, and his view of the city. He realized that he had built a life where everything was perfect, but nothing was alive. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of hollowness. He realized he wasn't free. He was just a man sitting alone in a glass box, waiting for the sun to go down so he could do it all again tomorrow. The lone wolf strategy had become a liability. It was preventing him from having the very thing he secretly craved, a home base. A place where he could be seen without being judged. Julian's experience is what happens when the invisible fortress finally stops feeling like a sanctuary. The walls are still there, but you realize you are the only one inside. Learning to stand on holy ground. The good news is that hitting the breaking point is actually the start of recovery. You cannot fix a house if you refuse to admit the roof is leaking. You cannot change your attachment style if you are still pretending that you don't have one. When Oscar Wilde wrote, "Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground," he meant that pain is the place where we finally become real. When we stop running from our need for others, we start the process of becoming secure connectors. This doesn't mean you have to give up your independence. It doesn't mean you have to become needy or clingy. It means you learn the dependency paradox. The more you allow yourself to have a secure base in another person, the more independent and adventurous you actually become. A bridge that is burned can be rebuilt. But this time, it shouldn't be a bridge made of wit, or intellect, or distance. It should be a bridge made of vulnerability. Vulnerability is not a weakness. It is the most courageous thing a human can do. It is the act of saying, "I am here. I have needs. I am afraid of being hurt, but I am willing to stay in the room anyway." For an avoidant person, this feels like jumping out of a plane without a parachute. But as you will learn in the coming chapters, the parachute is actually the connection itself. The very thing you fear is the thing that will save you. The first step toward the bridge. If you feel like you are approaching your own breaking point, or if you are already sitting in the middle of your own burnt bridge, don't panic. The fact that you are reading this means you are already looking for a way back to the mainland. The lone wolf path is exhausting. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to keep people at a distance. It takes energy to monitor your boundaries 24/7. It takes energy to find flaws in people so you have an excuse to leave. Imagine how much energy you would have if you didn't have to do that anymore. Imagine what it would feel like to walk into your home and feel a sense of relief because someone is there who truly knows you, and you don't have to perform for them. The journey from the fortress to the bridge starts with one small realization. You are allowed to need people. It is not a flaw in your character, it is a fact of your biology. You are a social mammal. You are the descendant of people who survived because they stayed together in the tribe. The bridge isn't going to be rebuilt overnight. You spent years, maybe decades, tearing it down. It will take time to lay the new stones. But every time you choose to stay in a conversation instead of checking out, you are laying a stone. Every time you admit you are tired or sad instead of saying, "I'm fine," you are laying a stone. Today, you don't have to tear down the whole fortress. You just have to be willing to look out the window. Take this one action today. Identify one deactivating strategy you used in the last 24 hours. Did you ignore a text for 3 hours just to show you were busy? Did you find a flaw in a friend or partner to make yourself feel superior? Did you retreat into your phone to avoid a real conversation? Don't judge yourself for it. Just name it. Say to yourself, "I am using a wall right now because I feel a little bit unsafe." Simply noticing the wall is the first step toward finding the gate. Chapter 6. Autonomy, the Great Avoidant Myth. In the mid-20th century, a strange and heartbreaking trend was noticed in hospitals and orphanages across the world. Even when children were given the best food, clean clothes, and warm beds, many of them were not growing. Some even stopped breathing altogether. In certain institutions, the mortality rate for infants who lacked human touch and emotional connection reached nearly 100%. They had every physical thing they needed to survive, yet they were dying. This discovery shook the medical world. It proved that human connection is not just a nice-to-have or a luxury for the lucky. It is a biological necessity, as vital as air or water. It is the oxygen of connection. Without it, the human spirit, and sometimes the human body, simply shuts down. During this time, most experts believed that spoiling a child with too much affection would make them weak. They told parents not to pick up their babies when they cried. They argued that the goal of parenting was to create a self-made person who needed no one. This was the era of the tough-minded individual. It was the birth of the great myth that we are still fighting today. The idea that total independence is the highest form of maturity. John Bowlby, a British psychiatrist working at the Tavistock Clinic in London, looked at these dying infants and the affectionless children in his care and realized something was terribly wrong. He saw that the more we try to force ourselves to be independent by cutting off our feelings for others, the more fragile we actually become. He spent the 1950s and 60s proving that our need for others is not a flaw. It is our greatest strength. The secret of the secure base, Bowlby began to study how children explored the world. He noticed a pattern that felt like a riddle. The children who were the most adventurous, the ones who climbed the highest on the playground and talked to the most strangers, were not the ones who were forced to be independent. Instead, they were the children who had the strongest, most clingy connection to their parents. He called this the dependency paradox. It sounds like it shouldn't be true, but the data showed it clearly. The more we can depend on someone else, the more independent we become. Think of a mountain climber. If a climber is standing at the bottom of a steep cliff without a rope, they are going to be very cautious. They might only climb a few feet before the fear of falling becomes too great. They are independent in the sense that no one is holding them, but they are paralyzed by the risk. Now imagine that same climber with a high-quality safety rope and a partner at the bottom holding that rope tight. Because they know they are caught, they are willing to reach for the higher handhold. They are willing to take the risk of a difficult jump. They end up climbing much higher and much further than the person without the rope. In this scenario, the rope isn't a leash that holds the climber back. It is the very thing that allows them to be free. Bowlby realized that human relationships work exactly the same way. When we have a secure base, a person we know will be there if we fall, we have the confidence to go out and conquer the world. When we try to live without that rope, we spend all our energy just trying not to fall, which leaves us with no energy to actually grow. Julian's glass tower. In his minimalist office overlooking the gray waters of Elliott Bay, Julian Vane felt like he was the ultimate mountain climber who didn't need a rope. At 34, he was a senior architect at one of the top firms in Seattle. He prided himself on his creative autonomy. To Julian, collaboration was just a polite word for people slowing me down. He was currently working on the blueprints for a new library. It was a massive project, the kind that usually required a team of 10. Julian had insisted on doing the core structural design himself. He stayed late, worked through weekends, and ignored the emails from the engineering team asking for a sync-up meeting. In Julian's mind, his independence was his superpower. He didn't have to wait for anyone's approval. He didn't have to explain his vision to people who wouldn't understand it. He sat in his glass-walled office, a lone wolf in a world of sheep. He felt powerful, but he also felt an exhaustion that went deeper than his bones. He was holding his breath, trying to be perfect, because he knew that if he made a mistake, there was no one there to catch him. One Tuesday afternoon, a junior architect named Sarah knocked on his glass door. Julian didn't look up from his screen. He felt that familiar itch of irritation, the sense that someone was trying to encroach on his territory. "Julian, I was looking at the load-bearing specs for the north wing," Sarah said softly, placing a printout on his desk. "The weight of the green roof seems to exceed the support of the cantilever by about 15%. If we build it this way, the glass facade will crack within 2 years." Julian felt a cold spike of panic in his chest, followed immediately by a wave of defensive anger. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to tell her to leave his office. But as his eyes scanned the numbers she had circled, he realized she was right. He had made a simple human error in a late-night calculation. He had been so focused on being independent that he had become a liability. His autonomy hadn't made the building stronger. It had made it dangerous. For the first time, the silence of his office didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a vacuum, where the air was running out. He realized that doing it alone wasn't a mark of skill. It was a strategy he used to hide his fear of being seen as imperfect. The internal working model. Why did Julian find it so hard to ask for help? Why do so many of us feel that needing someone else is a sign of losing a part of ourselves? John Bowlby argued that the answer lies in something called the internal working model. This is a mental map we all carry inside us. We start building this map in the first few months of life. It isn't made of words, it's made of feelings and expectations. If when you were a baby, you cried and someone came to comfort you, your map says, the world is safe. Other people are helpful. I am worthy of care. If, however, you cried and were ignored, or if your parents were only there when you were doing something impressive, your map says, others are unreliable or intrusive. Needing someone is dangerous. I have to do everything myself. For the avoidant person, section of their map is huge, while the connection section is marked with, here be dragons. We tell ourselves that we are choosing to be alone because we value freedom. But the truth is often that our internal map doesn't show us a way to be close to someone without being hurt or controlled. This is what Bowlby called defensive self-reliance. It isn't true independence. True independence is the ability to move freely between being alone and being with others. Defensive self-reliance is a compulsion. It's the feeling that you must be alone to be safe. It's not a choice. It's a survival reflex. When we live by this myth of autonomy, we create a life that looks impressive from the outside, but feels hollow on the inside. We build glass towers like Julian, but we live in constant fear of the first crack. False autonomy versus true agency. It is important to distinguish between the false autonomy of the avoidant mindset and the true agency of a secure person. False autonomy is built on a foundation of fear. It says, I don't need you, because it is terrified of the answer to the question, will you be there if I do? It views relationships as a zero-sum game. If I give you an hour of my time, I have lost an hour of my life. If I let you know my secrets, you have leverage over me. It is a state of constant defense. True agency, on the other hand, is built on a foundation of security. It says, I am a whole person, and I choose to share my life with you. A person with true agency doesn't fear that intimacy will erase their identity. They know that their self is not a fragile thing that can be stolen. Because they have a secure base, they can be more creative, more daring, and more generous. Think about the differences in how these two mindsets handle a simple weekend. The false autonomy approach. You make plans for your Saturday without telling your partner. When they ask what you're doing, you feel suffocated and controlled. You view their question as an attack on your freedom. You go do your activity, but you spend the whole time feeling resentful and guilty-ish, which ruins the fun. The true agency approach, you tell your partner, I really need some solo time this Saturday to recharge. I'm going to head to the bookstore for a few hours. Because you have communicated your need and you trust the relationship, you go to the bookstore feeling completely free. You don't feel guilty and you don't feel suffocated. You return home feeling refreshed and happy to see your partner. In the second example, the person is still being independent, but they are doing it within the context of the connection. They aren't running away. They are taking an excursion from a secure base. The cost of the lone wolf myth. The myth of autonomy tells us that the lone wolf is the strongest member of the pack, but in nature, a lone wolf is usually a wolf that is in trouble. Wolves are social animals. They hunt better, sleep safer, and live longer when they are part of a pack. A wolf on its own is a wolf that has to spend 100% of its time on guard. It can never truly rest. When we adopt the lone wolf persona in our relationships, we pay a massive price. Hypervigilance. We are always scanning for signs that our partner is getting too close or trying to change us. This keeps our nervous system in a state of constant low-level stress. Missed opportunities. Like Julian and the architectural error, we miss the insights and support that others can provide. We limit our own potential because we refuse to outsource anything. Emotional shallowing. To keep people at a distance, we have to keep our own emotions quiet. We turn down the volume on our sadness and fear. We accidentally turn down the volume on our joy and excitement too. We think we are protecting ourselves, but we are actually starving it. We are denying ourselves the oxygen of connection that we were biologically designed to breathe.